Hey y'all, I'm Kelly Moody and you're listening to the Ground Shots podcast, an audio project exploring our relationship to ecology through conversations and storytelling with farmers, herbalists, craftspeople, naturalists, artists, and more. It's the same to you, all of Hey y'all, it's Kelly. Welcome to the Ground Shots podcast. Right now I'm recording this at sunset behind a grocery store in Globe, Arizona, and I just got out of the Winter Count Ancestral Skills Gathering, and tomorrow I head to Oak Flat, which is a place that I went to with Signal Fire, the organization I've mentioned in the podcast a few times this past fall, to hear about the mine that is slated to go into that spot. And the Apache Stronghold is doing a walk for the next couple days. This coming weekend, by the time this episode goes out, it will be done. Gabe and I are going to do the walk and learn more about the whole issue and just kind of be open and there. And that's pretty close to where the gathering happened, so we just thought it made sense to jump on this walk to protest this mine in prayer. I'm going to be in the Southwest for the rest of the winter, and after this, headed to the Gila National Forest to hang out with a couple herbalists and some other friends and to get some solo time and do a few interviews and just to study plants as the flowers come out. Actually, California poppy just started popping and biscuit roots are coming up, and it seems like the creosote bush is going to be flowering at any moment. And yerba mansa is just starting to pop its little leaves out. In the riparian areas, the cottonwoods are starting to really shift out of their bud state and about to flower. So it's pretty cool to see these slight changes happening in the Southwest right now. So this episode of the Ground Shots podcast features a conversation with Nikki and Gabe again, who was on the podcast a couple episodes ago. Episode number 31, which was all about wild tending basics, and we recorded this conversation the same day that we recorded that wild tending conversation this past fall in Paonia, Colorado on Small Potatoes Farm. So at the Winter Count gathering, Nikki and Gabe taught about wild tending basics, and they did stuff that was regionally relevant to the site where the gathering was happening, but also stuff that was universal. And I sat in on most of their classes and walks to really take in more of what they're trying to share. And it's really interesting because when we recorded the wild tending conversation in the fall, the cadence of our conversation sort of drifted towards the ideas of what invasive plants are, because inevitably, one of the things that they are doing a lot is gathering seeds and replanting them along with mostly native plant seeds, replanting them in order to increase diversity, but also they're doing things like digging tubers and replanting them, or burying branches, or cutting back and coppicing things in order to increase the health of certain ecological areas. There's a lot that goes into what wild tending really is in the field, depending on the environment you're in. But some of what they plant, like certain stone fruits, for example, are not necessarily native or wild, the way that we define those words. And I think it's been on my mind to consistently detangle and deconstruct what wild is, for example, in our modern times. And I think that this idea of invasive plants being bad, or the idea that something from a foreign place coming in is inherently evil or bad, is something that we need to step back from and just take a look at in a different way. And I think that Nikki and Gabe do a really good job of talking about this, because it comes up in the wild tending conversations, and it comes up in a lot of conversations about plants and herbalism and sustainability, and how can we exist in the modern culture that we live in today as humans in right relations. Like, what is the right way, And I don't know if I exactly have the answer for that, but I think that's one of the things we're exploring on this podcast, is how should we relate to the land and the world we live in now. So I think this conversation with Nikki and Gabe is a continuation in a way of the wild tending conversation, but it's focused on reevaluating what we think of as invasive plants and the roles they might play in the ecology and healing the land, and maybe that we should perhaps reevaluate how we define those things. So in the classes that Nikki and Gabe offered at Winter Count, this seemed to come up naturally in the audience and in the with the students. So kind of reaffirming that those conversations just need to go hand in hand, I think, at least in my opinion. I'm excited to put this episode out now after people have had some time to digest the wild tending episode, which seemed pretty popular. So thanks y'all for listening to that. And I got a lot of good, fun feedback on that episode. I invite you to listen to this episode with an open mind and just consider some of the things that Nikki and Gabe are talking about and have heavily researched. So if you want a reminder of who Nikki Hill and Gabe Crawford are, their bios are on the website upsedgeandsalt.com, and it's listed in both this episode's show notes and the other episode that they were on, and again, that was episode number 31. In this episode with Nikki Hill and Gabe Crawford, we talk about unpacking the use of war-making language when talking about invasive and native plants. We speak on the political and economic influences at play in the conversations around so-called invasive plants, and this is something that really struck me, Nikki's research into the politics of this created enemy of invasive, and it's definitely well-researched information. We speak on how the desire to protect sage-grouse habitat is being turned against other native plants like the pinyon juniper forest. And this is just one example of something that's growing in the range that it's grown in for a really long time, being called invasive, even though pinyons and junipers have been there. They're called invasive because they're encroaching on sage-grouse habitat, and that's just one example we bring up in this conversation. We also speak on exploring the idea that plant succession can happen when conditions change, which we all know that's happening in our world right now and in a way has always happened. We talk about scapegoating invasives instead of facing a massive fragmentation and devastation that we've caused ecologically in the past several hundred years. We speak on the bias in ecological and restoration research, and some of this is based on Nikki's experience working in that field for many years. We speak on considering deep time when thinking about what plants are native or so-called natural. We talk about how awesome Russian olive is, and just listen and you'll learn why it's so awesome. We speak on using invasive plants as medicine. We talk about how invasive plants can remediate a damaged environment. We speak to some ways on integrating traditional ecological knowledge into invasive species interaction, and TEK, traditional ecological knowledge, is something we spoke about a little bit in the conversation on wild tending a couple episodes ago with Gabe and Nikki. So before we get to the episode, I just wanted to remind y'all we have a Patreon, and that's what funds this project 100% at this point. So if you feel compelled to support this project and keep it going, you can find it at patreon.com/ofsedgeandsalt. And I am soon to be upgrading my camera, and I'm going to be uploading more videos, nice quality videos on there. Yeah, adding more stuff like that, educational video stuff for patrons of the podcast and the Ground Shots project. So head on over there if you want to subscribe to support this project. There's all different tiers of support, whatever works for you. You can also share this podcast on your platforms or word of mouth, and you can rate us on iTunes, and that would be super cool. So let's go ahead and get to this conversation with Nikki and Gabe, and I look forward to hearing what you think about it, and happy listening, y'all. Burn, burn with the light that reveals our faces. Burn, burn with the heat that will warm these places. Hey. Part 2. Nikki and Gabe. Our first conversation, we talked a lot about wild tending and ways that humans can be a part of nature and be participants in the reciprocity that we are supposed to be participants in. And something that I've been interested in for a while is invasive plant medicine, or the idea of this goes into our conversation about defining what wild is too, and really what got me into herbalism in the beginning of my journey was going to a talk with, I think his name is Timothy Lee Scott, who wrote Invasive Plant Medicine. Have you heard of that book, Lucy?
Yeah, I ran across it.
Because I lived in New Hampshire and he was doing a book talk, and it kind of blew my mind, like starting off thinking about like wildness and plants and medicine and the ways that plants exist in place and our cultural perspectives on them. Yeah, and then from there, that was kind of like a foundation for me to like think about and rethink what is wild and what is natural and what is native and all that. So Nikki, you co-wrote this really awesome zine that's sitting in front of us on the blanket called Troubles of Invasive Plants, and in it is like a ton of really awesome research and like observation and documentation of your own experiences. And then y'all could just start by speaking a little bit to why you think that we even have this concept of invasive plants in our modern culture.
Well, I think the reason we have this concept is probably got many threads, right? I think one of the threads is that people feel bad or nervous about the level of disturbance we've caused in this modern age. And also, you know, people feel threatened by like biodiversity loss and stuff like that, and feel some sense of concern. The other reason I think that this term has been created is it feels easier to have something to blame, to focus on, rather than trying to change a whole life way. This is a part of one of the threads, I think, is that in some way it's a war-making. It's a war-making culture. I mean, we see that in lots of ways. Like, I don't understand what fight climate change means, for example. You know, like something's going on, but what do we mean fight it? You know? Or some of our biomes are shifting and the forests are not able to be growing where they used to be able to. How do we go about helping by like making a battle? I don't know. But I think that's part of where this comes from, is we have some of that mentality. At this point in time, I think it's kind of a colonizing mentality myself. I think it's still that same dominating rut that makes us feel like there's somebody to blame rather than a whole way of doing things to look at. Not even to blame, but like, oh, well, these are some things that happen from different ways of interacting. And I also think that there's a part of like a guilt that people feel that we should set things we want to do right? So we want to set things back to how they were before we were involved. Again, bringing up the separation of the human from the wilderness is a part of that thread, I think, as well. Is that we only did harm. We need to set it back so wilderness can just exist on its own again without us, and we shouldn't even go in there very much. And so we need to set it back to how it was. Like we broke a china bowl on the shelf and we want to glue it back together and put it back up there, but the glue is toxic and it's cracked and it's never gonna hold what it used to hold, you know, like, so I don't know. I think those are some of the threads of why we have that. I could just go into it too. I mean, the things that we found in doing the zine was also, I think that there's been a lot of political influence in promoting this idea of invasive plants and animals into the common vernacular. And there's a little bit more of that going on than I really assumed there was once I started going into the research. It wasn't what I was looking for when I started. But there was a invasive plants panel that was created in the late 90s. I think it was 98 or something. And under Clinton, I think. I'd have to read the zine again.
I read that the other day. Yeah, it was in the Clinton administration.
Yeah. But from the very beginning, Monsanto was actually on the board, you know. So I don't know. I wasn't expecting to find that there. But I went to school for environmental science and botany, and I remember learning about this term invasive, when I was in college, and this was in the early 2000s. But how the word was being used then feels really different than how it's being used now, which is kind of, I don't know, different. But invasive was when I was learning about it, was a term used to describe a particular relationship that was being observed in a particular place. So it was more of a descriptive word for an action that you would be observing. Oh, what's the relationship going on here? Oh, it's these ones do look like they're covering these ones. That's, invasive. These ones aren't making it much anymore. That was where the term came up. The way the term is used today is anywhere you find this particular species of plant, it's called invasive now. So it's a very different way of using it than I was introduced to it. So, yeah, I forget what your question was. Yeah.
Now you just to define, or like to name maybe why we even use the term invasive now. And I think it's interesting too that we have these other cultural things happening where we consider things invasive, like people crossing the border, this like creation of a problem in an artificial enemy where there doesn't need to be. And in that, there's almost like, it's like people either need something to do or there's money generated from the aggravation, which is what's interesting about this concept of invasive plants and this creating of a war on invasive plants, like reading through the scene too and reading about this creation, this like during the Clinton administration, creating that panel, and like all this money then got put there, and then who gets half of that budget every year? Because you were talking about every year it gets increased to that the chemicals, so that you document in this all the different ways that we're so-called fighting invasive, and one of them is through chemical use, and then who gets all of that money?
Yeah,
because these chemicals are being bought to restore ecosystems because of invasive plants. But what I've found interesting too is that like we're using this word invasive to even describe plants that are not coming from a faraway place but have always been here.
Yeah, this is kind of the further disintegration of the language, to where that's the reason why I feel like it's just, the threads of why we have this term is because it's a war-making culture. We haven't overcome that part because it is starting to lose its meaning. So like with the pinyon juniper is the example of where some people have used the word invasive. They have these projects going on where they're removing tracts of pinyon juniper that they say are encroaching into the sagebrush habitat. They're chaining them down, large tracts of them. They're chaining down the tracts that are recovering from being cut down 100 years ago, but they're saying that they're encroaching into sagebrush habitat.
They're using a certain time period where they're like one little moment in time where there had been a bunch of logging and said that this is what we need it to be like. But it's like putting pinyon juniper at war against sagebrush. What? Like
right. Well, and they conveniently pick a time that was just after all of the mining operations throughout the West that cut down all of those forests to feed the smelters to smelt the ore. That's the point in time that they chose for that one. So, yeah, it was 100 years ago. So that term has been used to call them invasive encroachment into a place they were before even. So that's kind of the disintegration of the language when the way in which it's being used is with this enemy mentality.
And can I also ask, because this is something that I've been wanting to educate myself more about, is how that relates to the whole sage grouse predicament in relation. Have you how it's like?
Yeah.
Because they use the sage grouse as like the leverage point of their habitat is being threatened.
Yeah. No one's questioning.
But nobody's really questioning it.
Ranching.
I mean,
practices.
I think it's favoring the ranching practices, but it's also, from what I learned hanging out with Finn, it seems that pinyon juniper forests are one of the only ecologies that are voluntarily thriving right now and actually growing.
Juniper seems to be a tree species that is doing well with some of the climate changes that we're seeing when other forests are disappearing. So that's interesting. Should be someone we're rooting for, even if she is encroaching beyond where she was historically, in my opinion. But yeah, the thing about the using the reason for the sage grouse, they did this removal of pinyon juniper before, back in the 60s, with the same reason for sage grouse, right? With a little more upfront that it was also for ranching, that it was for increasing grasslands, right? But it was the same reason was presented then as well for sage grouse. It hasn't worked. It's in 60 years.
Hasn't worked yet. They're continuing to get funding.
So it's a very thin veil of that makes any sense. I mean, it really... The sage grouse habitat is the valleys where that sagebrush would be growing that's been tilled out for the crested wheatgrass and for other cattle forage, and there's increase in that and not enough for the sage grouse.
Okay.
Because those grasslands wear out. You take out the trees, you get 1 year of good grass production, maybe 2. I mean, I don't know the particulars of it, but you get a little while before it's compacted, and you have the cheatgrass come in to take over from the compaction that's happening that can't support those native grasses anymore, and then you're going to need to clear more space for better forage again.
Because often it's really clay soil that once it compacts really hard, like that the sage habitats really like. They like that clay.
Yeah, and they're a little more delicate ecosystem in some ways. The desert, like it's got that cryptobiotic soils on top, and you have these large animals and higher concentrations than they probably were for a while, at least in the formation of those soils surfaces. So you have a lot of things start to disappear. I was just reading the other day about the importance of some of the what did they call it? VAM soil bacteria. It's like a type of soil bacteria that the symbiosis with the plants is that they actually are like penetrating each other at the cellular level, the plant roots and the microbes. And that's like something that they're finding is really necessary in the sagebrush habitat. And so the sagebrush is like a host for that, those soil microorganisms as well. And that those microorganisms can't actually live on their own very long at all. Like they need to have a host plant relatively soon, otherwise they die. And so that might be a part of the thing that's missing too. When they take out the sagebrush or the juniper and the pinyon, they're chaining it out with big chains between 2 bulldozers. That's how they're doing it. So they're ripping up a bunch of the sagebrush too.
And the cryptobiotic soil crust that takes a really, really, really long time to regenerate amongst all that too, huh? Yeah.
So it's a thinly veiled excuse. It has been since its insight back in the 60s. Yeah.
It's something that there's like a couple ways this is looking. It's like that native plants are often being called invasive, like goldenrod or pinyon, juniper. Even though pinyon is having troubles right now too with the pine bark beetle.
Yeah, it's not very linear, making sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then there's this other side of like using the word invasive to describe plants that have moved into places where they haven't historically been. At least sometimes we're picking a point in time what we're calling like this is the pure historical range, but then it's something even in your conversation about wild tending that is brought up is like that humans and other animals and wind and all these elements move things constantly, and what is really something that's native and not native is also a part of the conversation, I think, and maybe rethinking how we look at deep time, rethinking how we look at what plants belong where and why. And it's hard sometimes for people to like accept that. Even the most well-meaning people sometimes I see talk about like, they wouldn't spray something ever, but then they'll spray that Japanese knotweed because it's evil. Yeah. You're like, interesting. Yeah,
I think there's a big reformulating of this relation for sure. I mean, I think the first part, again, to start with, is to recognize that you're working with other intelligent beings. These plants are very much alive and intelligent and responding. They're responding to conditions as they are now, not to how we'd like them to be. And so they get used as a scapegoat. If they're responding to conditions as they are, they're here to help. Because plants set up set up the conditions that will be conducive for the next group of plants to come in. That's how they function together. This is succession. People talk about succession. But then we get hooked on succession as always happening in exactly the same way that we saw it happen once. You know? Like, oh, these shrubby plants come in first, these particular shrubby plants, then these trees, and then the climax, like steady state, is these trees that like to grow up in the shade that was made by these other plants that came first, that could handle more sun. Just because it was those particular individuals before doesn't mean it happens that way again, especially if the conditions have changed. You're not going to get the same set of characters coming through. You just aren't. So I feel like using this invasive plants thing is like it's a scapegoat for not recognizing or not wanting to look at or not wanting to accept or something. It's a scapegoat for the altercations, the massive disturbance that we've caused, massive fragmentation. Like, you can't go any place in the United States more than 25 miles from a road. That's some pretty severe fragmentation. Part of what we're, see with the plants is they create this fabric of the landscape. There's patterns throughout the landscape. They're showing you things about the soil and the water conditions, what's available. They're also adjusting things in there, adjusting salinity, adjusting nutrient composition by their existence there. And when those things change, other people can come in who couldn't quite deal with that before. It's a beautiful dance. And so wherever they're showing up, they're telling you something about what's going on there. And these things take time for conditions to change. So if we get hooked on how it should be to a point in the past, we'd have to be ignoring everything that's happened since then. We can't just set it all back. We can't take the broken china plate and put it back on the shelf with the glue. It doesn't work. And you can talk to different restoration people who've been doing it a while, which I have, and you can also start to find some articles of people talking about how it's not working. Restoration is failing, but we're not talking about the failing most of the time because we have this apprehension that we need to do something, and we're going to get stuck in this rut because this is the only way to do it. Is every restoration program starts with eradication. This is part of why I got out of the field. I worked in restoration for 2 years. That's what I was really passionate about, and I couldn't handle it. I couldn't find any job that wouldn't require me to do eradication. None. And I don't think that felt like a dominating place to be coming from still. It didn't feel like a healing place.
Yeah, you talk about that a little bit in the zine, being hired to spray a bunch of stuff, and then
I didn't do the spraying, but I was told there was a professional coming, and you could tell he'd been doing it for 30 years. He didn't seem like he could see very straight, and he was wobbly, and he talked about how he would just spray the plants, and there was this huge amount of overspray going into the creek, and it's just like, that's a professional. Wow, like, somebody should look after that guy. That's a long time to be working with that stuff.
Wow.
But yeah, so I didn't do the spraying, but I did all the other stuff.
Yeah, and every step of it seemed either apathetic or not done well or based on like weird, not very backed up scientific evidence, or things weren't documented truthfully, or it's interesting, all to generate energy. Like, these people are just being employed to do this thing, but no one really understands the best way to do it, and it's not being done the best way. And it's because if cows have eroded a riverbank from it being overgrazed, and sure, there's something restorative we could do there, but it doesn't have to look like that. It could be like planting willow.
Yeah.
Again, I think there's something, like you were saying, about the fragmentation, like this problem that's been caused by this like toxic culture that's come into this land, that instead of owning that that's happened, and like that we can just do work that like repairs those things in the way that it is now, or that these plants have come in and they're like, well, you're not going to repair it, so we will. Instead of like accepting that, it's almost like them we're vilifying the plants that we're calling invasive, like autumn olive or Japanese knotweed, or like plants that rebuild soil or clean the air or like hold things together. And it still reminds me of a parallel to like, you know, creating wars in like Central and South America, and then now we have all these people migrating, and then now we're calling them the enemy, even though we caused the problem in the first place. So it just really makes me think about that, you know, and plant migration, human migration, and climate change all wrapped in that too. And
Totally. I mean, life is just an evolving thing, is what it seems to me. I don't think that there's a steady state. There's a dynamic equilibrium that happens, or there's some balancing going on, you know, but it's not a steady state. Things can be pretty dynamically in equilibrium for a long time if we're doing things in like a harmony, you know, we're appreciating things that are there, we're working with what's there, with who else is there, the other plants, in a way that like it works. It's not a fight. It's a flow. It works. A fight is not working. It's just not. And I had this thought the other day too, you know, like I was doing this garden and I posted a picture of this plant to get an ID, and I was like, oh, this is mallow I've never seen before. She's really pretty, you know. And people were like, oh yeah, she's this. Too bad she's invasive. I was just like, whatever. I'm like, it's so hard that one comes up so easily from everybody. It's like just in the vernacular. Even people who aren't studying this stuff, it's just what people say now for any plant that's not from here, from some picked date, you know.
or feels too wild or too out of control or too hard to control. Because I don't know if it was Gabe we were talking about this, or I don't remember. Or this plant in one place is being called invasive even though it's native, and in another place it's being called rare.
Right.
Even though it's native supposedly everywhere. It's just all about the context of the place and what people are wanting.
A good example of this is chickweed. It's a little invasive weed that some people really don't like, but they're actually... I found out recently that there's actually farmers that are growing giant fields of chickweed.
Yeah.
Now as like microgreens and for like skin medicine.
Oh,
and
she's
stuff.
super helpful.
She is, but it's funny, just like the double standard, or like I went to National Grocers and bought like a little bag of dandelion and burdock to make tea with, and I was like, oh, these are both like invasive plants, you know, but these are probably getting grown in a field where it's like nothing but dandelion and burdock.
Yeah.
You know, so just kind of seeing those double standards.
Yeah, we have to ignore our agriculture in order to be calling these things invasive. We have to ignore the fragmentation that happens from enforcing less diversity in a big way in all of the valleys in order to have this fight. And this is a thought I had the other day with this little mallow friend, I was like, you know, I wonder if some of these plants that we call invasive European plants over here, that they showed up after agriculture happened in Europe too. Maybe they weren't even originally from Europe. Maybe these plants just show up when these conditions are prevalent. They're little magicians. They're like, we're the ones that can be here and do this job of rebalancing for other people to be able to live here. Why isn't that the story? I'd be curious to look into that, actually, if you can find records of plants pre-agriculture in Europe. I don't know.
That goes into what is agriculture too, you know.
Yeah.
Well, it's actually, I wanted to like work this in a way that's like as a good segue in a way that's seamless. But you know, this mentality that you're talking about of always needing an enemy.
Yeah.
Right. Which is, even though that there can be a solution-based approach with that same mentality, you're just going to cycle right back into you're going to become the monster you're trying to fight, right?
Yeah.
In the big, you know, I'm really kind of like not super into the whole scene of, you know, the rewilding scene as it is, because it's like become, I've noticed, like another ism, you know, like this rewilding ism, this dogmatic kind of religion where people are policing each other on what is and isn't rewilding. And the big enemy that they've brought now is agriculture and everything. There's like, it's kind of funny that the blame, right? It's like, oh, it's all agriculture's fault. And this was like, that's like the big enemy, and that's the big blame that we're putting everything on. And the more I've like kind of been flowing into this wild tending work and trying to do it in a good way, I've actually, you know, coming up against a lot of those preconceived notions that I've embraced, but finding them really conflict with like ways where I actually see that like small scale, like horticulture and agriculture is actually okay. It's like really, I don't think it's a bad thing, but like there's been this it's been pitted against like it's like the worst thing that ever happened. And I think that there's some merit in that, but it's just like that same mentality that you're talking about of like needing. That's like the next trap that's being set for us, right? You know, is like, oh, this is our new enemy, and then we're just gonna go and then rewilding in another 100 years, like, oh, rewilding is the new enemy. It's almost like there's like this cycle of like ping-ponging back and forth of like just finding a new enemy, getting into a big mess, and then bouncing back into a place where it's like, okay, what's the new enemy to kind of put the blame on.
And where's the line between what's agriculture and not? And that's like a big conversation I've had over the years.
Yeah.
Both like with like people talking about like history and philosophy and anthropology and looking at like the timeline of humans and how they engage the land in different places, but also in like conversations with people who are really deeply entrenched in like rewilding culture. And sometimes people don't know how to answer after a while because they're like arbitrarily like defining where that line is.
Yeah.
And their preferences for engagement. Like I remember one time I grew a bunch of heirloom dent corn, and I was a farmer, you know, growing cultivated foods, but also harvesting so-called weeds to eat. And I even put in my CSA shares weeds. Dug burdock root, put it in my CSA share. There was like a flow happening there, and this corn, you know, corn is a whole conversation too, and like human interaction with a grass that then they favored over time to be this amazing food. And I was trying to trade with someone who was really into only eating wild foods, and he didn't want to trade my like special cornmeal that I grew because he's like, it's not wild. Sorry, I'm not gonna trade you my whatever. I don't know what it was he had to offer, but for that, because it's not wild enough for me.
Yeah.
I'm like, that's interesting because where are you putting that line, you know?
Yeah.
I think this is another example of the threads of war-making culture is extremism.
Yeah.
And so we get caught in this place where our trying to figure out or understand something, we have a conditioning from this culture of war-making and extremism to go way far one way or the other way. You know, so it's like all agriculture is bad or, you know, not, you know? So like when I think of agriculture as the impact it's had, I'm thinking of large-scale monoculture agriculture with the plow and the chemicals and all that stuff. That's what I'm thinking of. And the compaction. It's like this, I heard this term recently, which maybe is useful, is this theory, well, it's a theory of moderate disturbance. And I think it's in part a response to some of this extremist tendencies to where you start to have a conversation and everything's polarized as either like it's all this way or the highway, you know. But so it's this theory of moderate disturbance, which is trying to get to the place of like understanding that creatures living here have some level of disturbance, and that's a part of the dance. That's a part of the health of everything. And you know, different cultures we can think of had different levels of disturbance that they were using in order to be living here and to encourage their food sources to be more, you know, prevalent and abundant. Some of them had more of an understanding of the importance of diversity. Any, you know, small gardener or any small farmer would know these things as well, you know? Like I learned these things in my small garden. After a couple of years of being there, there's all these different birds coming. I had a neighbor who was an Audubon guy, and he's like, wow, I haven't seen these kind of birds in a long time. That was a garden, you know? But that's not a big monoculture agriculture where I'm tilling all the time, spraying a bunch of chemicals on thousands of acres. I think it's different. That kind of big agriculture is also doing the fragmentation in a big way, where you have places where different people can't migrate through anymore because there's nothing for them to survive on going through those sections, you know, or they get shot at or whatever. But this theory of moderate disturbance, I think, is a good one to be looking at a little bit more to bridge that conversation. Because at this point in time, we're relying, for the most part, on that big ag still. And we're all trying to unhitch from it in different ways. But I don't know if, we are just going to continue to pit ourselves against each other and come up with a new bad guy over and over again. It's that same...
It's a vicious cycle.
It's still that cultural tendency of battle, of dominating, I think, that causes that polarization as well.
And to something that we were conversing about yesterday with the moderate disturbance is... An example that I'd like to add into this is my experience on the tableland digging yampa, you know, and how timing is everything to make the yampa 10 times more abundant. When you wait until the yampa is ripens, when the seed of the yampa is ripe and ready to plant back, you can go and plow the crap out of a whole field of yampa thinking you're destroying it, and then you watch you come back in the next couple years and it's just a carpet 10 times thicker than it was. And that's why we dig in that time, because every time we dig, we're planting back 10 times more than we took.
And that's an example of a time frame of moderate disturbance versus if you did it when they were just coming up in the spring. That's a much larger amount of disturbance because of the timing. So it's really, there's this intricacy. And Finn and I had this discussion about this whole thing, and she was, I noticed that the roads that go through the tablelands, when they plowed up the roads on both sides of the road, there's like these big mounds of dirt that go along the road. And I noticed that some of the thickest yampa was growing on those mounds along the road. And that's because, and I talked to Finn about it, she said, well, that's because they plowed up this road at the perfect time of the year, and they actually like just created a condition that made that yampa grow back 10 times thicker. Like they made this road during when the seed was ripe. And that's why it's like some of the best yampa digging is like right on the side of the road, because of perfectly timed disturbance. Yeah. Yeah, there's all these dynamics that we're playing with, and that's the part that we start to step out of that relationship when we start to have too much of an ideology about like this is how it needs to be, or this is the method you always use, and then you see how it happens in the culture. Then that starts getting applied very broadly. You know, like I couldn't find a job without eradication doing restoration. That's a broad stroke that I couldn't find anything. You know, so that's where the ideology comes in, and you're stepping out of the actual relating. The same thing happens that I found in a lot of the research that's done. Because a lot of the facts that we think we have about invasives are actually based on bias. If you follow the threads of the reports, people are quoting other quotes from other papers that still didn't prove in their research that one plant was taking over the other plant.
I think you mentioned that there's some quote that people use a lot that like, let's see, what is it, that the invasive plants are responsible for the eradication of diversity, or like a third of,
they're the third largest threat to biodiversity.
Which is based on a quote that's taken out of context, that the original author says, no, that's not what I meant at all, but people still use it as truth, right?
Yeah, David Wilkov was one of the people who he was doing, I have to read it again, but he was doing some of the research, and he was misquoted. He said that later. And also the person who then went on to perpetuate and have his own data for this declaration of them being the third largest threat, Pimentel. It's just kind of funny math. Like everything's thrown in there. You have to realize this. When people are using that, the only way that it works is a lot of the studies were based on islands, which are a very different habitat than the mainland. Like 80% of the data is from island ecology.
Like Hawaii, for example?
Yeah.
Okay.
And the other thing that's added in there is that you're also adding in things like viruses like AIDS. They're called, AIDS is also a part of making up the statistic for invasives being the third largest threat to biodiversity.
Wait, AIDS?
AIDS and other viruses, yes.
Wow.
So it's very funny math. We have a chapter in there on the funny math of this declaration, which is the war rally cry for lots of projects, right? The other thing that I found was really interesting was that plants that are considered invasive, and remember that now we're having this species is invasive wherever we're finding it, right? Unless it happens to be the place we're saying that they're from. They're not included in the biodiversity index. They're just not even in there. So you're missing this huge amount of growth, of plants growing, that's not even accounted for when you're coming up with biodiversity loss and what's going on. So if we actually wanted a clear picture of what's going on, of how things are shifting and moving, how things actually play together and dance together, we're not going to get that picture that way. You know, like he was bringing up the example of the, plant being endangered in one place and invasive in another. Those are the kind of things that aren't being represented by leaving them out of the biodiversity index. You can't see the pattern of like, hey, they're disappearing here, but they're coming up over here. Oh, maybe they're telling us. Maybe they're trying to tell us what change is coming. They're responding.
And then we can actually help them, and that's like maybe you can touch on that a bit, the term of assisted migration, but maybe that's them asking for a little bit of help to move, and because I think that's a relationship that people have had with plants, is like we're like their feet sometimes. We'll just like help them.
Yeah.
We can help move them around.
Yeah, it's a part of what we do, and that's, a part of the invasive things too, is we're meant to feel bad that, we would ever accidentally carry a seed into somewhere, because if we carried one of those seeds somewhere, it's just going to take over. And it's like, it's really hard to get something to stick, a plant to stick somewhere, if the conditions aren't right for that plant. Especially for them to stick in a way that they're going to reproduce and seed and flower and propagate. It's not like that happens from just dropping a seed. It doesn't happen that way.
Yeah.
Any of us who have gardened or farmed know that. Or done restoration. Like, it doesn't happen like that. So what we're seeing these things happening is because the conditions are right for them.
Can I add in about this relationship between these plants that would be called invasive and humans? Is there's a type of wild hyacinth, which is in the lily family. It's a type of brodia, a lily that only really grows up in the northwestern United States, but it's found in this southwestern corner of Colorado, only in this southwestern corner of Colorado.
It's like a little island population.
It's a little island population that only exists here.
Whoa.
And, it's because the Utes really liked this brodia and actually brought it down here and planted it themselves. So this is a practice that's actually been happening for a long time, because it's a native plant, but then botanists are like, wait a second, there's actually something, when we look around, this is the only place where this so-called native plant is growing. Everywhere else is all the way up in the northwest, where it has actually a lot of numbers.
Yeah.
So that means that somebody brought this plant here a long time ago.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean...
Would that be an invasive or what? It's like...
I don't know. I mean, the belief in that term disappeared for me entirely 2 summers ago.
Mm-hmm.
I felt it
That
leaving.
it even is a real thing. Yeah.
Yeah, that it even actually is relevant at all. Honestly, that's where I've come to it. And it's not I feel like it's been a very informed and seeking pathway for me to get there. I've been looking, but I mean, I knew from the beginning, I felt that it wasn't right, that we're going to start a war with these, we're just imposing something again. That's what we're trying to restore, was an imposition, right? But I don't believe in it at all anymore.
So it's like,
doesn't make any sense.
The term iatrogenic injury, like it's an injury or an ailment caused by the medicine that was supposed to cure another ailment or injury. I feel like that's a really common thread with this whole restoration kind of malpractice, and like eco medicine, right? Because like we're causing these iatrogenic injuries, upon landscape and ecology, because we're trying to fix it with the same mentality that we had when we created it, and when we broke it in the first place.
Same hammer.
Yeah,
and the same hand.
We're introducing some bug to try to get rid of this invasive plant that we don't even know how that bug's going to act, and then all of a sudden it...
And that's that lesser of two evils thing again, too. That you find well-meaning people will end up having certain instances where they're like, oh, I don't want to spray, but in this instance, like, I feel okay with it.
You'll hear the term a necessary evil quite a lot when it comes to using pesticides. Like, it's a necessary evil that we have to...
And I don't understand why we should be satisfied with that, actually. I do think it's also a way in which we're stepping away from direct engagement.
Mm-hmm.
And direct engagement in a way that's understanding that all these other plant people and animal people and soil, everything is intelligent and alive. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's what we live off of. It's why we're able to be here. So how could it not be highly intelligent?
Mm-hmm.
So is there a way to follow that lead? And trust. Trust that way of relationship will find us to a place that's healthy and sustainable, that we can still be here. And that everybody else can still be here, So.
We all talk about some particular specific plants, too, in all of this, because I'm always fascinated, too, by, like, every plant or group of plants has, like, really interesting and unique ways of acting. Like, in the West, there's a lot of specific plants. Like, I think in this one you write about, what is it? We mentioned it in the wild tending conversation, too, where you started to go into that, like the
Russian olive?
Russian olive, for example, is like, there's tons of energy towards trying to eradicate this, and you I think you write about it in this, and we've talked about it a little bit, like, you've gone out and spent a lot of time just watching the land and observing how much the birds love this tree, and you met, I think it was in here, you written in the zine, like, you met some people who were coming to do bird surveys or something, and they hadn't even thought to consider the Russian olive as, like, something to note. And all of that. And it's because almost like you put a blinder up because it's invasive, so it doesn't matter.
There's this bias of harm. You put this label on, and then the bias immediately starts. That's what it does. That's why the term is irrelevant if you're actually trying to see what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
The bias is immediate. You put the term invasive on there, you're not thinking beneficial at all. And so then you can't see it. And they talk about this, found this term, it's called positive bias, that is happening in science, that some people are talking about in research, is that people are the positive bias is that you're always trying to prove your hypotheses. So even if your research didn't prove the hypotheses, your statements are still claiming that it did in some way. Your statements don't change. What you were thinking you were going to find is what you state in the end. Because that bias is there. This is a part of how the human mind works.
This is what you want to be the truth.
Yeah, this is a part of how the human brain works. So that's the part of why these terms are irrelevant and shouldn't be used if we're actually trying to work with the human mind and try to actually see what's going on. Because that bias is hard to get over once you really have such a strong bias, and it's really strong now, you know? But, yeah, so you can't see the benefits that may be there. You can't actually see the interaction that's going on. So we camped out by this place in Nevada on this creek for like 7 days watching, and I've traveled all around Nevada and along a lot of the different creeks, and there's all this Russian olive growing there. Not remembering her Latin name at the moment, but she's really dense along this creek. And every morning we'd wake up and there'd be like a flock of like 15, 20 cedar waxwings just chirping around in there and eating the berries. Every morning they came. And it's a bunch of other little songbirds. It's a really nice place to be. And then these people came in because it had become known that this was a little canyon that had a high diversity of these songbirds. And they were coming in to put out bug traps to see what the birds were eating. And my friend who was there, Finisia, she was like, well, we've been watching them eat these Russian olives all week long. And that was just totally news to them. And I hope that they consider that, you know, because otherwise, like, we have these well-intentioned, we want to protect that these birds are all here, we're going to come in and eradicate, because that's the program. I mean, that's how a lot of these restoration projects are funded, is through eradication. Like, that's how you get money for your restoration. And so people who are trying to do these things get in that trap, where they don't have another choice but to implement some sort of eradication program.
And that positive bias thing comes in too, because if you don't continue to believe that meme, then you won't get paid. So
that's why I'm not paid. You know? Like, so then I was talking to this botanist nearby, you know, and he was talking about his project they were just starting. They had a bunch of Russian olive there, and he was just talking about how they're trying to get the currents going, you know, the native currents there, and how they had them out on irrigation in the field, and they're just not working, and wondered if I had any advice for him. And I said, well, you know, the only place I've seen the currents coming back in the whole state of Nevada is underneath those Russian olive trees. And I'm like, that's the only place I've seen them. So, in succession, I would suggest that you plant them under the Russian olives in the shade.
And they were like,
near the creek.
Okay.
No, he felt bad. He felt a little bad because he's like, well, we're applying for eradication grants right now. Like, and we were having a nice conversation where he was understanding that a lot of the restoration's failing. It's not working. But that they're trapped in this thing. They're doing a grant writing for the funding for eradication so that they can fund doing their project to try to do restoration there. So they're going to have to eradicate something.
Oh, God.
You know? Like, people who have been doing it a while, they know this, too. This is what I've been getting from talking to some of them.
Or you could just get one big grant to leave the Russian olive and just put a bunch of those...
And work with succession.
Underneath.
The other thing he brought up, which is a part of this bias as well, is that these things people say, like, oh, that one can't be here because it's inferior forage.
That's a big one.
So that's what they said about the Russian... That's what this guy said about the
inferior forage to who and what, you know?
I don't know, but, you know, first thoughts was, so if someone took away the food I was eating because they thought that it wasn't the best food I should be eating and expected me to wait 10 years for the food that they thought I should be eating to grow, I'd probably starve to death or have a hard time. You know, if someone did that, that wouldn't work if someone did that to me. The other thing I thought of, well, I did some research and I looked up Russian olive. You know, I couldn't find any papers talking about research into how she's invasive. Not one, actually.
Oh, wow.
None. I mean, she's called invasive, but not one research paper talking about why and how. Not one. What I did find was a whole bunch of research that's been done, mostly in the Middle East, by nutritionists who have been studying the fruit of the Russian olive because it's a superfood. It's a special type of fruit that has oils in its flesh, essential fatty acids in the flesh of the fruit.
Isn't it? It's an Iliagnus? Is that a genus?
It's in the olive family.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
It's related to autumn olive too,
right.
I think, which
Yeah.
out east we have. It's also considered
Didn't we look
They're
it up the
close
other day?
relatives,
Didn't
yeah.
we look it up the other day? It was
I
like
think it's Iliaga
Iliaga
naceae or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah.
they're
that
really
is ringing a bell
sweet,
now.
delicious
like
little fruits. So the more time I've been going out and nibbling on them, you know, I actually like. They really are incredible to nibble on.
And you can cure them just like olives, but they're like a nutritional powerhouse. So the inferior forage thing, it's like it can't stand up.
Yeah.
That's
All the
not
research-
that's actually untrue information.
Because from my own personal observations, I've found many different kinds of animal poop filled with Russian
are eating
olive
them.
seeds. You know, which
It's
means
obviously not inferior.
yeah, you know.
Yeah. And you know the other thing too, I love Russian olive. I think it's beautiful that she's volunteering on all of these rivers, you know, that have had different histories of abuse, and she's just a part of the landscape now. Same with the tamarisk tree, salt cedar. She's another one with a history that's not well proven for what they say she does, but tamarisk and Russian olive are like the third and the fourth most common tree species in the West at this point in these deserts. So if you're talking about eradication, you're talking about taking out the large portion of the vegetation.
There's not a lot of trees in the desert.
How
And
does
just
that
think
seem like
about
a good
how much
idea?
wildlife actually really loves tamarisk. You know, like the birds that actually build their nests.
The flycatcher that's
yeah.
endangered
Yeah, they really
favors tamarisk, actually.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Kind of to add on to that, I was observing my dad's property that I grew up on. He, you know, when I was in high school, he like tried to build this big bike track, you know, and ended up falling through. Now it's just like actually turned into a big pond. And I've noticed every year how a new succession of weeds will come and completely take over the whole banks of this bike track. And one year it was like the tumble mustard that covered every portion of it. One year it was thistle. One year it was fillery. And other kinds of mustards that have come in. All of these are so-called invasive noxious weeds. This year it was wild lettuce. Completely just like grew a thicket of it all over it. And this year, because this past year a couple years I've gotten really into birding, and then I came back because I've been gone from Colorado for a bit, and I noticed this fall that there are like the densities of songbirds that are hanging out on this property just for the thickets of wild lettuce is incredible. Like they're in, like I would walk by the patch of lettuce and like flocks of songbirds would fly out of it. You know, there's a lot of juncos and different kinds of sparrows, and they really like the seeds and the bugs. You know, there's a lot of thistle and that purple orich, you know, lamb's quarter growing all over the banks, and the birds like love these weeds. You know, if they protect them, they can hide inside of them. There's bugs that go into those thickets that the birds eat, and they also eat the seed. And I think the birds are actually responsible for planting a lot of these things, because once that pond filled up for the first time, we noticed over the years that all these birds would come to our property: ducks, geese, herons, sandpipers, dowitchers, killdeers. And then we noticed that willows and cottonwoods, we have like longleaf cottonwood. Is it longleaf in Fremont?
There's Fremont, there's black cottonwood, then there's like an Arizona.
There's like two types of cottonwoods growing up out of the banks
like
of the velodrome. One of them has a long leaf, and then one of them is Fremont. One's we got willows, and we also have tamarisk growing up. You have cattails and bulrush, and the birds actually came and planted that whole pond ecosystem. You know, like we just filled it up with water, and then they came from all the other wetlands and all of the other ponds and rivers and like just planted it for us.
Yeah.
You know, and then they stick around now because of like the so-called invasive species that are growing all over the banks now. You know, they actually really love the forage that it gives them, and the safety and the shelter.
Colonization is a term for new plants coming into an area. Pioneer species is another one. Or plants coming into an area that's had a lot of disruption. That too. Not even necessarily plants that came from somewhere else, just colonization of a new disturbed area. But there's this term that was referring to that like there's this some initiation lag that happens, that often these pioneers that come in, they're really only there for a certain amount of time, and then they go away on their own, like without anybody doing anything, right? And there's lots of examples of that. You just described one.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you're talking about succession, right? So
Yeah.
certain ones come in because that's what's meant to happen there, and how they come in with birds or with people, or maybe they're just all in the seed bank to begin with.
Yeah.
And they come up when they need to. I don't
Yeah.
really know. You know, I think there's a lot more things to be looking at in different ways. But you also see this other places. And I appreciated what you said the other day, that like maybe they're just not done yet. Maybe that's why kudzu's still all over there. She's just not done yet. Her job's not done. Like there was an example of the zebra mollusk. It's not a plant, but was taking over this big lake.
Lake Powell.
No, it was this lake in Siberia maybe, or somewhere in Africa. I forget. But it was this big lake, and the zebra mussels just like came in, and they're getting really thick, and people were frustrated and freaking out. And mostly because they would, you know, live in the pipes and stuff, clog up their drainage for moving water different places. But even, you know, different eradication things they were trying to do didn't seem to be doing anything. And then eventually, the mollusks all just left. And the water was clearer. And there was more fish and different things going on in there than there had been before. There was a similar story with some water hyacinth. This was in Africa, was this big lake that had a bunch of water hyacinth, and people were worried about it, and they found out that she was repairing the waters. She's taking out the excess nutrients and making it more habitable for other people later. In the meantime, yeah, she looks like she's dominant. Well, because she is. Because she needs to be there. That's how much medicine is needed. You know? So there's all these successions. They
I'm
just have
curious
different time frames.
about Phragmites in areas, those aquatic grasses that, you know, some people like have a big vendetta against, you know?
You know when they come back the strongest? After you spray for restoration? Yeah. That is when they come back the strongest. You know, funny, another thing about Russian olive was they actually initially were planting her as a remediation tree for a glyphosate manufacturing plant.
What?
So maybe, hopefully, she would still be here through continuing to be doused with that stuff if she was already known to be resistant.
Isn't it a nitrogen fixer too?
Yeah.
She's a nitrogen fixer, and she also can grow in shallow saline soils that other plants can't grow in. And part of what she does is she's taking up some of that salinity, which might make it more inhabitable for some other people to come back.
Yeah.
The other thing that's special about her, since we're talking about her, once you start to look at them and without that bias of harm, you can start to understand a lot more things about what they might be doing. You converse, right? So the flesh of the fruits, they also planted Russian olive around mining sites because she takes up heavy metals. And like in Nevada, you know, there's tons of mining done. You know, a lot of the rivers have been churned up for the metal, a long time ago. The repercussions from that are still around. That's part of why we're seeing these plant people here who have these abilities. So even her fruit falling into the water absorbs heavy metals.
Because it's like kind of pectin-y, like spongy, isn't it?
Yeah.
Wow.
So in that way, it's not concentrating in other places, you know. It's some sort of moving it through into a concentration that might be better for everybody.
Or transforming it in some way. Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
I also heard this other theory sometime back, which I thought was interesting, and I think there's some relevancy to it, about looking at the medicinal characteristics of these different plants and what areas of the habitats they are thriving in, and making correlations between there. Like with the knotweed, knotweed is a very good lymph cleanser for your lymph glands and your lymph system, which is basically your water system, your flow system in your body of all your different antibodies and stuff like that. Well, she's showing up in all of these creeks. That's the lymph system. You could see it as a lymph system, you know. So, I don't know. There are friends.
I think in that book, I don't know if it was a Stephen Buhner's book on healing Lyme specifically. I think it was in that book. And also Timothy Lee Scott, which was a student of Stephen Buhner who wrote the book on invasive plant medicine, spoke about the correlation between, and this is just like a theory you can like draw from just looking at maps and evidence and history and and you can decide for yourself what you think about it. But like a correlation between where Japanese knotweed has spread and like the spread of Lyme disease, which it's one plant that's really good for working with limes, and also it's got tons of other benefits like being on the rivers and holding the soil banks and and that we're just ignoring it, trying to eradicate it, spray it, dig it up, whatever. And it's a traditional Chinese medicine, for lymph-like stuff or like reforming capillaries and things like that. It's really, and kudzu too is a traditional Chinese medicine and food. And it's just, we're just looking at it as this thing that's out of control, but we could just eat it and use it for medicine,
I just start the relationship that's there to be had, have a conversation with the friend that's sitting next to you.
And it's, I don't know, I just thought of this. I had never really thought of this, but I guess one of the uses of kudzu root is for alcohol addiction, or like alcohol hangover, or like you drink regularly and have body issues from it. Like kudzu is used. I'm like, oh, in the South, kudzu was taking over the South, and there's lots of alcoholics in the South. I'm like, that just came to my mind. I don't know.
Yeah, it came to help the culture too. Yeah.
People are weaving amazing baskets actually out of kudzu. It's like becoming a thing. Weaving culture in the South, this new thing that's emerged.
Yeah.
Where people are, they're doing really beautiful things with it, and that's cool to see. So,
totally.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You said something, Nikki, about the mentality of invasives. I think it'd be really important to bring up on this while we're here, because you said, I forgot exactly how you said it, but it was just about the mentality against it is still, even if people kind of change their behavior, their mentality still stays the same. Like, you're still calling something an invasive, and it's like really kind of that mentality. You remember what I was talking about, what you were saying?
I think so. Like, some of the movement towards some people, which I appreciate, I think it's mostly been herbalists who've been bringing about this part of the conversation, which is that we should just be using these invasive plants. That's a way to like be managing them. That's kind of the idea, right? So there's a little more positive like bent in there into that part of the conversation, which I do appreciate. I still find it limited. I feel like we end up tying part of our hands if we're still buying into the invasive part at all. I've seen conversations online with different foragers and restoration people, plant people, and they're talking about these things in lots of different like ways, trying to actually be talking with the plants and understanding that they're intelligent and all these things, but they're still using the invasive part. And it's just like,
the language
as long as we're using that language, we're tying one of our hands, because there's some way in which we're still buying that story. So we're going to be conflicted. That's how we get into that state where we end up choosing the lesser of two evils or the necessary evil.
We still feel like we're eradicating it by using it for medicine.
Yeah,
instead of just engaging it as a living being like any other living being.
Yeah. And maybe even appreciating. I mean, what if the story of our place and time right now was that we started to understand that all of the world is here to support us and each other? That we're actually all here in this together. Like, we actually really are. Like, not just giving it verbiage. No, we're actually in it all together. So, these other people that are responding by moving or doing things, that's because they care to continue too. So, what if we really embrace that? What if we could actually get there to understand that there aren't things out against us all the time in every form and fashion? Like, what kind of a different thing would start to unfold? Scientifically, it ignores succession. It ignores fragmentation. It ignores land use to just be going after individual plants. In our conversations about engaging in a more participatory way, it's forgetting to use the term invasive that's to be forgetting that we're working with people and respecting that they're just as highly as intelligent as we are, maybe more. So that's the conflict that we have by still using that word. We're still not fully believing the new story we're trying to create. We're still holding back a little bit, just in case we're wrong, right? Somehow, you know, like the big kid or the teacher is gonna like laugh at us because, oh, see, it doesn't work exactly like you said it did.
Little ego in there.
Yeah.
There's like that cultural hubris, really tied up scientific hubris with it, you know, because it really is everywhere, and there's a lot of pressure. It's a very triggering conversation to have.
Oh, I know. I'm all fired up.
People. That's why I think that this is such an important conversation to be having, talking about like on a platform like this podcast, because I've been observing and reflecting on just like the propaganda around invasives, and you know, when I was driving through Oregon summer, there was like a big sign in this ag land community that said, do your duty to control noxious weed, you know, and it almost has like this Uncle Sam kind of vibe to it, where he's like pointing his finger. He's like, I want you to control, you know, these invasive noxious weeds, you know.
Yeah.
And that's like, there is a lot of social engineering and, you know, and propaganda with it, and it's really thick, you know. That's why it's hard to have kind of civil conversations about invasives.
Yeah.
You know, and this is like something that's still really new to me, because I realized that up until recently I had a lot of these same preconceived notions and mentalities, you know, that I just wasn't really aware, you know, and I've been opening myself up to this, and then also just from my own observations too, just seeing like how like at my parents' property, for example, just like how much bird habitat, you know, that these noxious quote unquote noxious weeds provide, you know, and that's like, it's feeding the wild. It's not really taking from it, it's feeding it, you know. Then when you hang out with Finn, you know, she'll say that she's like, if it's food, I don't care how invasive it is, we're gonna plant it, you know, as long as it's food.
That'll piss some people off. Like, I'm going around planting Russian olive.
Yeah.
Oh my
And
God.
thankfully, like for Russian olive,
She's doing all right on her
we
own.
don't even have to. Some of them, like we don't have to plant them at all. Like Russian olive, she's so versatile in planting herself, but
You could just interact with her with the succession. Go plant the fruit underneath her.
underneath her, yeah.
You know, or you could think about planting the cottonwood or the willow that you're saying if she's taking over underneath her, but I bet they wouldn't grow. I mean, and there are studies talking about this, because it's not the right place for them. There's not enough water. We've changed the flood dynamics so much that we're not having the right flood conditions to support cottonwood and willow in some of these places. That's why she's able to come here.
Yeah.
That's why the cottonwood willow isn't there. It's not that she pushed them out.
Yeah.
You know? So in the meantime, like, there's just so many other ways we can interact rather than always coming to eradication first.
Yeah.
This whole succession. I think the eradication first also is like an agricultural mindset, that you got to clear the field first before you plant. You know? Why? You don't have to clear the field before you plant.
Plant in the field with everything. Yeah.
Yeah. If you're thinking about the succession, plant something that likes shade under there. Because if you took her out, there'd be no shade, and you're not going to have your berries for 20 years now, because you got to wait 10 years for those trees that you put in to grow, if they even do, and you're going to have a large percentage that die. And you just by doing these things, we just keep setting that succession back to an early stage over and over again.
I think a really important piece for this is when I'm comparing this predicament to traditional ecological knowledge, which is a body of knowledge accumulated by indigenous peoples living on a particular landscape for so many generations, that the traditional ecological knowledge passed down was actually countless generations of direct observation passed down orally from generation to generation, but they were never fixed. You know, that like each new generation would actually observe new things to add on to the accumulated body of knowledge. And I think that that's a really important way of being with this new world that we're kind of living in. Like this is I don't think we've actually given a lot of these things enough time
No.
to really know what's going on.
Yeah.
You know, we're just kind of making like really hard assumptions right away, because
Looking short-sightedly too.
yeah, very short-sightedly.
Yeah.
You know, because a lot of these things really do take generations to kind of.
Yeah, I mean,
Can take generations.
took generations to alter it in the way we have.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so
Right.
it'll take generations for it to sort itself out. you know,
Yeah.
and sorting itself out, I don't think that it repeats itself. Like, nobody ever said that it repeats itself in exactly the same way.
Yeah.
I mean, I haven't heard anybody actually. I mean, that's kind of what we're assuming, but I don't think that's actually been proven. I kind of don't think it does.
Yeah.
You know? Yeah.
I was thinking about too the story you were telling the other day about, was it Enzo Borrezzo? Is that how you say it?
Borrego?
Yeah, where you went. There's like a sign there that talks about how
It was a newspaper.
hikers were spreading invasive plants with their boots, this particular wild mustard or something, and then you were really thinking about it. You're like, that doesn't actually make sense.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and it was, you figured out that it was probably from some agricultural thing at some point instead.
Well, we were sitting in the middle of the desert reading this paper we picked up in town, and we were actually under some beautiful tamarisk trees. I was really glad that the salt cedar was there. And she was just growing in this one section. She wasn't everywhere because there's not much water there at all. But wow, that shade was nice. There's birds and people living in there. But anyways, so we were enjoying the shade of the tamarisk, and we were looking out reading this paper, and we saw this. We were next to this old homestead that's all gone now. It's just the foundation and some metal and stuff, and, you know, a pen where they probably used to have some kind of livestock. Well, where they obviously did, actually. But we're reading this paper, and we're looking at this flattened square with some green grass in the middle of this desert. It doesn't have any of that grass going on around it. You know, it's just the desert. And this wash, kind of. And that's where the mustard is. Very dense in that square where the livestock was. We didn't find her anywhere else outside of there. Like, she basically ended at the square. And so it was just a really funny moment to be like, there's a big hole in this conversation again, too. It's like somehow we want to ignore the land use we've been using, and like that's the cause of changes in dynamics in communities, not the plants themselves. Maybe that's really compacted, nobody else can be there. I mean, there's a reason that she's just in that square. That's not a hiker. I mean, that'd be a really smart hiker if he knew that that was the one place in the desert that one would grow. Or is it just like chance that he walked in there with that one on his boots? You know, like I don't know. So there's gotta be something else going on too. Like, these plants are coming up because that's where they need to be. That's what conditions are calling for. They're like, I need your help. People are like, oh, you know, with the white top, you can't even eat her. He's like, well, maybe you don't get to eat everything. She just got to do something for a while. Why don't you just plant some seeds underneath that you want to eat? She'd probably be fine with that. You know, they'd probably like the shade. There's just different ways of going about it. But yeah, it was a really funny moment to be like, I don't think that's hikers. I think we're missing big parts of the conversation, you know, by making an enemy.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe because we're afraid of making ourselves the enemy. I don't know. I get it. I don't know. It's funny.
Yeah. I think that's the thing. Yeah, it's like taking personal responsibility collectively too, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's like the hardest enemy we have. We project the enemy we have within ourselves onto everything else, but really, you know, that's like the funny thing about this mind we have, is that, you know, it's quite tricky.
Yeah.
It's kind of a trickster, you know.
Yeah, it could be so hard to like feel that inner sense of like guilt or shame or disappointment, that you're like, oh, I've got to go out.
Yeah.
I've got to put it out there.
Yeah.
No, that guy sucks. See, we got to go after them. Now I feel better.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Was there anything else y'all want to add to this conversation about invasive plants and just the whole culture of thinking about it and the word invasive and wild and all of it before we wrap up? Also, where can people find this zine?
People can find this zine on my friend and co-writer's website. It's called maxkamoksha.com. Maxka Moksha Press. I can spell that if you'd like me to.
We can just put it in the show notes.
Oh, okay, do that.
Yeah.
Yep, but maxkamoksha.com. And under publications, you can find different files for printing your own to distribute as you would like.
And a free PDF download.
Free PDF downloads.
Cool.
Yep.
That's awesome.
Spread them far and wide.
Yeah, it's really good. I'm like...
Yeah, it is a very well-researched piece of work, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's just the beginning of a conversation again.
Totally. I know there's so many nuances about it all. I'm really curious what people are going to say, too, in response, because there's so many perspectives on it all. But your research is well backed up, so yeah.
Well, I just know it in myself.
Mm-hmm.
Like I'm not
You're
really worried.
Too. Yeah.
Not really worried about it. There just has to be a different way than having an enemy to be being here. I just yeah, it doesn't make sense that they wouldn't be here because that's what conditions call for. You know. Other than that, we'll see what else appears. You know.
Well, thanks, y'all.
Yeah.
Thank
This
you.
is great.
You.
Yeah.
In your gizzard we found Russian olive seeds, soon to be trees, back to the ground, coming back around. In your gizzard we found.
Hey y'all, thanks for listening to this episode of the Ground Shots podcast. And I just wanted to remind you here at the end of the show that we have a Facebook group for the podcast, and it's linked in the show notes of every episode, and it's on the website of sedgeandsalt.com. And if you request to join, I always say yes, and that's a place that you can discuss the conversations that we've had on the podcast or share any resources that you have that relate to the episode. And I also wanted to say that in the show notes for this episode, I've linked a few resources related to some of the plants that we touched on in the podcast, some of the so-called invasive plants, and a few other things too. So check that out if you're interested in kind of expanding more of your research on this topic. I've also linked some of the things that I talked about on the podcast with Nikki, the zine that she put together with Calibri, that is linked. The PDF is free to download, and that's linked in the show notes as well. And if you want to look at that research and see like the documents that they found and all of, a lot of the resources that they found to back that up, it's all in there. So it's really fascinating, and they write it really well and kind of humorous sometimes too. So check that out that way. And also, I want to mention that the interstitial music for this episode is by Joe Hedges, and you can find Joe's music on Bandcamp, and it's linked in the show notes for this episode. And I found Joe's music through Signalfire. Joe's a alumni and offered their music a little while ago, and I was like, I really want to put Joe's music in the podcast, so finally got it in, and I'm excited about that. And the extra little music is at the end is Gabe Crawford playing banjo, a song about Russian olive that he came up with, and funny little tune. But that's it. Thanks for listening, y'all, and can't wait to release more episodes on wild tending. I'm going to be releasing more episodes soon that are tagged on to the Brian and Mary episode that just came out about bookbinding and papermaking and crafts. So I'm going to be doing kind of the next few episodes related to either of those topics. So hope you enjoyed it again. And until next time, bye y'all. This episode of the Ground Shots podcast was produced by Opia Creative. Our music is by Mother Marrow. If you'd like to help us continue to make this audio project a reality, consider becoming a monthly supporter on our Patreon page at patreon.com/ofsedgeandsalt, where we have rewards like entry into patron-only giveaways, additional audio interviews, extra educational content, and much more. You can also share our work and give us a review on iTunes. Visit our website at ofsedgeandsalt.com. to see what else we're up to and a log of our episodes when they come out. Check out our show notes for information about how to find us and our guests. Until next time, y'all, thanks for listening.